This is a Global News special presentation. Live coverage of Federal Budget 2023. Here is Donna Friesen.
Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the latest federal budget to be delivered by the federal government. We're here to explain what is in it, what it could mean for you and your bottom line, and what the spending priorities are for this government. And as with every federal budget, there are some traditions, some rules in place. First off, the Finance Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, along with the Prime Minister, will enter the House of Commons. Now, I'm told that they have preempted a little bit of what we usually happens right at 4 p.m. Eastern, that they already have walked down into the House of Commons. Maybe we could go to Mercedes Stephenson and just fill me in if that's right. Normally, we wait for that to happen. We wait to see the Finance Minister stand in the House of Commons and begin to deliver the budget before we can then tell Canadians what is in it. Mercedes, I understand there was already a photo op with the Finance Minister?
Bit of an unusual photo op just upstairs above me here. They then come down the stairs to enter the House. It's sort of just around behind me, so I can't see them. But when the embargo will lift on what's on this budget, when we can actually tell our viewers who are watching and listening about what's going to happen, will be when the Finance Minister stands. And that's when the embargo lifts, and we can tell you what is usually in a very thick brick-like document, all the spending, if there's cuts, what the plans are, and how all the politics of this will play out.
Now, we know some things have already been leaked, telegraphed, if you like, about what's going to be in this budget. And we know the Finance Minister has promised to do two things, which is exercise fiscal restraint, but also make significant investments. How does any politician do both those things?
It's a tough thing, Donna, because this is an economy where there are storm clouds gathering, and a lot of economists are saying we could be on the precipice of a recession. So they need to spend and help those who are struggling the most. It's tough even for middle and upper income Canadians to pay the bills they were paying before. If you're on a fixed income or a low income Canadian, things have gotten really, really tough. So we're expecting to see some things, for example, like Global News reported yesterday, a GST rebate on groceries for low income Canadians. But you're looking at about $250 for a senior, for example, or just over $400 for a family. So not huge amounts. Not a lot of money or tax cuts for the middle class that we're expecting, or at least that we're being telegraphed in advance of that. But at the same time, there has to be some big spending that they've committed to. And this is a government that, as we know, likes to spend. But they are also recognizing that they have to balance that spending with the fact that right now they're worried too much money into the economy could make things worse. It could contribute to inflation. It could devalue our currency, and those are very real concerns. So they're having to strike a balance in this budget, especially after all those years of big COVID spending.
As we watch the House of Commons there, we're just waiting for the Finance Minister. There she is. She's on her feet. We'll just listen in for a few seconds, Mercedes.
Monsieur le Président, conformément à l'article 83E du règlement, j'aimerais déposer dans les deux langues officielles les documents budgétaires du 2023, y compris les avis de motion de voix et vote.
Including the notice of motion, the ways and means.
In these documents, pursuant to Standing Order 83-2, I am requesting that an order of the day be designated for consideration of these motions. Seems a good idea, right?
I'd support that.
Thank you.
Bravo. You do support that.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's economy has made a remarkable recovery from the COVID recession. Last year, Canada delivered the strongest economic growth in the G7. There are 830,000 more Canadians working today than when COVID first hit. We have recovered 126% of the jobs that were lost in those first months.
Now that the finance minister has begun to deliver her budget in the House of Commons, we can fast forward to what is in it. Our chief political correspondent, David Akin, has spent the whole day in the lockup with economists and other journalists poring over the document and has some details of the big takeaways.
We needed in this budget to find a balance between continuing to invest in Canadians, to invest in affordability for Canadians who are feeling the pinch of inflation right now.
The budget centerpiece is a one-time cost of living rebate worth $467 for couples with children, $234 for single Canadians, and an extra $225 for seniors. The government is calling it a grocery rebate, but you can spend it on anything you want. It will be paid out to 11 million Canadians. When? That's TBD.
Given the pressures that household budgets are under, I can imagine that any amount's going to be helpful.
The government also promises to lower credit card transaction fees for businesses and prohibit what it calls hidden junk fees that consumers pay. Things like roaming charges or surcharges for concert tickets, even excess baggage fees. Freeland also announced an expansion of what is now called the Canadian Dental Care Plan. That's a plan that had covered dental bills for children in lower-income households. Now, by the end of 2023, any uninsured person in a household earning less than $90,000 can get federal dental coverage. The government is also scaling back a planned tax hike on beer, wine, and spirits. The alcohol excise tax will now jump 2% on April the 1st, rather than 6.5%. Overall, new spending commitments total $43 billion over the next 5 years, and most of that is a result of increased health transfers to the provinces.
This is, I think, a bit of a pivot for this Liberal government. It's a relatively small budget.
The government says its budget plan is sustainable.
We know that fiscal responsibility matters. We know that maintaining Canada's AAA credit rating matters. We know that not adding fuel to the flames of inflation matters.
All right, David Akin is standing by. David, I know you spent the day going through this. What struck you most about what's in this budget?
Well, it's what Sahir Khan, our expert from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, was saying, was it's kind of a pivot from traditional Liberal budgets, at least traditional since the Trudeau government took over in 2015, in that there is not a lot of new spending programs. The only one that consumers are really going to notice is, as we've told you about, is this idea of a cost of living rebate. It's what the government calls a grocery rebate. That's all spin. You can spend it on anything you want, and you didn't even have to pay for any groceries last year to get it. So that is the big ticket item for consumers, and that's going to cost the government about $2.5 billion a year, and yet that's small enough it won't be inflationary. So
David,
the smallness of it.
Can I just pick away at that for a sec? Is that targeted to certain? Is it means tested? Targeted to certain individuals?
It is means tested, Donna. You're right. So you need to have filed a tax return. I'm going to talk about that in a second too. You need to file a tax return, and if you are in a certain income bracket, low to low middle income, you're going to qualify for this one-time payout. We don't know when it's going to be paid out yet because the budget bill will have to clear Parliament. It almost certainly will do that because I think the NDP will find lots in this budget that they like. Big news on the dental plan, for instance. But yes, it's means tested. Now, the tax filing, you don't get many government benefits unless you file a tax return. And there are 2 million Canadians, most on the low-income end of the scale, who don't file a tax return and as a result are missing out on all these government benefits. One of the things in this budget, it's sort of a process thing, but important, is to account for automatic tax filing. So even for those Canadians who may not have much income, they don't think they need to file a tax return, there's going to be a system set up for automatic tax filing that gets you on the tax rolls, and most importantly, that would qualify you then for this one-time payout, for the Canada Child Benefit, and any number of other government benefit forms. So there's a bit of reform on the tax filing front here.
Okay, and David, can I ask you about something else that was sort of telegraphed that was going to be in this budget, was a reduction in the amount of interest that payday loan companies can charge. Was that in here?
Well, you know what, Don, I've been around Parliament Hill for, I don't know, seems like a lifetime. It almost is, 25 odd years. And I didn't know today that in the criminal code, there is actually a criminal interest rate, believe it or not. I think it's like 47%. So that if you charge someone 47% interest, that is apparently a criminal code offense. What the government is doing in this budget is lowering the criminal rate of interest, and they're bringing that down to 35%. I certainly hope to God if you're forced to borrow something at 35%, you can find someone else to borrow from, but that will be the rate at which it becomes criminal to lend money to someone. So that's where they did on the payday loans.
Well, I think that's important because there were a lot of anti-poverty advocates who were pushing for that, who said that these interest rates at payday loan companies are predatory, some say even criminal, because they are so high. And the people who rely on these payday loans, of course, are people who can't get traditional financing through a bank and need to pay their bills and need emergency funding. And so they're kind of have to rely on this. So,
and we talked about things that the NDP and Jagmeet Singh are going to point to and say, we did that. That would be one of them. They've been pounding away to do something about the payday loan industry and exploitation by the payday loan industry for some time now.
Mm-hmm. And what else, David? What about what else struck you that's not in here that perhaps you were expecting to see?
Things not in the budget. No real changes to your income tax rate, any tax rates. For the 70,000 Canadians who are super rich and pay what's called a alternative minimum tax, there is a bump. They're going to pay an alternative minimum tax instead of 15%, now 20%. But again, that is just 70,000 Canadians. So no tax cuts really for the rest of us. No adjustments to Canada Child Benefits, OAS, anything like that. And you know what also struck me on the housing front? I mean, we've heard a lot of governments at all levels talk about housing. We must do more about housing. Really not a whole lot in this particular budget on housing. You'd want to look to last year's budget to see what the federal government is doing on it. There is, in this budget, the federal government will be encouraging banks to adopt a code of conduct when it comes to lending. In other words, best practices that they'd like to see banks do a better job informing consumers, and in some cases will allow banks to increase an amortization rate beyond 25 years. What's the goal of that? Keep people's monthly payments the same or close to it, even if you have to extend the life of a loan. So some best practices for banks, no laws, no regulations, but it's sort of a nod to the fact that banks need to be more responsive to people who are coming and renegotiating mortgages at a time of rising interest rates.
And David, what is the finance minister saying about the prospect of recession in the next 12 months, which is what a lot of the Conference Board of Canada is anticipating, that a lot of economists are as well?
I don't think you'll hear the finance minister use the R word, the recession word, when she's talking about it. They'll talk about likely scenarios where economic growth is slowing. Economists we spoke to that were in the lockup are using the term a shallow recession. You've heard that before. And don't forget, a recession, when we talk about that, is 2 consecutive quarters, so 6 months in a row, of declining economic growth. But again, I think the consensus among economists is if we do have 2 consecutive quarters, it will be relatively shallow, minus 0.1%, minus 0.2%. It won't be that deep. But that's what they say. The government is anticipating slower economic growth, and as a result, that's why it's saying it's building in some affordability measures into its budget, the chief of which is its centerpiece, and that is that one-time rebate that it's billing as the grocery rebate, but which you can spend on anything you want.
Okay. David Aiken, thanks. We're going to come back to you in a little bit. Let's talk about the focus on the so-called clean economy. This government has talked for a long time about creating jobs in the energy sector that don't involve fossil fuels and of building Canada's green technology sector. The Americans, we know, are now heavily subsidizing that sector. So how do we compete? Turia Isri is looking at what's in the budget to address that. Turia.
Donna, the second biggest item in the budget after health is boosting clean energy. The government is spending almost $20 billion over the next few years on green jobs and technology.
The Liberals are trying to sell it as the most significant transformation since the Industrial Revolution.
Significant investments to build Canada's clean economy and create good middle-class careers.
The government is spending $18.5 billion over the next 5 years on things like clean tech manufacturing, clean hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage. Much of the money will come in the form of tax credits, which could be a boost to companies like this Edmonton startup.
It is really challenging, so having government support is really critical.
That support is meant to keep Canada competitive. The U.S. is spending massively on green jobs as part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
We would have liked to see more talk about fossil fuels. We know that the climate crisis is fundamentally an issue of fossil fuel production, fossil fuel consumption. We know that fossil fuels are also a really important part of the Canadian economy, and we need to have a mature conversation about that.
The federal government is also trying to Poilievre-proof the carbon tax by signing business contracts to make sure the program lasts. Other green measures are aimed right at the pocketbook. Ottawa wants a universal charger to work on all devices, Apple or Android, to cut down on waste and costs. The Liberals are also bringing in a right to repair to make it cheaper and easier to fix home appliances, electronics, and farming equipment.
The Liberals are also pledging $2 billion over the next 5 years to improve service at Canada's struggling airports. But passengers will have to pay slightly more for airline tickets. Security charges are going up between $5 and $10 next year. Donna?
All right, Turia Isri, on the investments, the changes that will affect Canada's energy transition, clean economy, if you like. We know that inflation is the highest it has been in a generation, interest rates higher than they have been in years. So how does this government view the future? How does it view Canada's economy in the next 12 months? Sahir Khan is with me. He's Executive Vice President of the University of Ottawa's Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, and he also spent the day digesting this budget. Sahir, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure, Donna.
Let's talk a bit more about what the government's expecting, predicting about the economy in the months ahead. Are they counting on inflation continuing to drop?
Well, they are, and the budget is basically built on a consensus private sector forecast that expects inflation to drop below 3% later this year and down below 2% later in 2024. And so then it brings it into the target zone for the Bank of Canada. So as a headline rate, I think the expectation is that this is going to be less of a factor, particularly politically. The difficulty is that households will continue to have built up their expenditures based on the accumulation of inflation over the last little while. And so the struggle will continue until wages kind of catch up. The other part of this forecast is the softening of the economy. So a bit of slack in the economy means that there'll be a little bit of that edge will be taken off inflation. Of course, it's a double-edged sword because then you might get an uptick in unemployment at the same time. But that's kind of the framing, kind of the economic framing of this budget, and kind of underpins the government's actions and what they kind of feel about the next 5 years.
And Sahir, just to get a little bit about that idea of a softening of the economy or soft recession, however you want to phrase it, how that can actually help potentially reduce inflation. It's not politically popular to say a recession could be good, but it could help with our inflationary pressures.
Yeah, and Donna, there are a number of causes of inflation in Canada, and some is, the pressure from the war in Ukraine, the post-COVID kind of supply chain hangover, and some, domestically produced as well. So when there's a recession, it just means there's a gap between the potential of our economy and where we're actually producing. That little gap, the smaller that is, the more pressure you're putting on prices generally. And when that gap starts to open up, there's a bit of a safety valve. It takes a little bit of that pressure on pricing. But again, like I said, that a recession is a double-edged sword because that slack also means that there's some segment of the economy that's not firing on all cylinders. And if it's unemployment, then we'll see a little bit of an uptick. But that kind of drives the fiscal plan of this government, and in terms of their expectations, they're going to have a bit higher deficit in this next year, and they're hoping that it kind of gets better over time as the economy recovers and inflation subsides.
The finance minister has said before that she can't help everyone with the impacts of inflation. But what do you see that she is doing, that this government is doing, that will help people the most?
Well, I think this idea of targeted measures to those who are really the most impacted, like this GST credit for groceries. It's a small measure, but for those who need it, it's going to mean something. We also have to remember there have been an accumulation of measures from the last budget and fiscal update that continue to flow through the system and provide assistance to Canadians. But part of the challenge here is that, ultimately the government has to be very targeted. So it wants to provide support to those who need it the most without putting fuel on the fire and driving inflation itself. I think they're kind of managing that very carefully and trying to make sure that fiscal policy and monetary policy aren't fighting each other.
Just to talk about the GST rebate a little bit, I think it's what David said. It's couples with 2 kids, so a family of 4 would be $467 a year in a rebate. Is that?
That's
correct.
right.
Yeah. So right, that's not. It's small in the grand scheme of things because we know food inflation has been rising faster than inflation generally. It's the biggest driver of inflation right now. So people are paying a lot more, but that will make a difference for some families. Sahir, is there? Do you think that the finance minister got the balance right here? If you're stepping back, looking at the big picture, spending enough to help some people and support investment, but not enough to risk driving up inflation, or will we just find out in the months ahead?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question, Donna, because I think part of the challenge here is that we're entering into a period of uncertainty. And that downside risk that was presented in the budget, I think it's worth paying attention to, because in the fiscal update in the fall, there was a downside scenario. And I think we kind of said, okay, well, how are we going to hit the average or the downside? We're kind of below the downside right now. So this could actually happen. And I think what really matters now is how the next few months unfold and what trajectory we find ourselves on. I think the minister was also trying to balance, kind of trying to curtail spending so that didn't get out of control either. And if the government did something that was not targeted and really quite expensive, then you're starting to fight the efforts of the Bank of Canada in kind of putting the limits, the brakes on inflation. So there was a balance here struck. I think the amount of money given for the type of inflation on food that's kind of impacting people has been probably the most stubborn, feels very targeted. The fact that it's addressing 11 million people and households seems to be a little broad for me. But I think time will tell, and I imagine that this government's going to be watching this very closely. It's a hot button political issue. People feel it. We all feel it in the pocketbook. So I expect that we could see off-cycle measures or the fiscal update respond even more aggressively if it's found to be necessary.
And Sahir, I think it's $20 billion invested in clean energy. I think I've got that number right. I wasn't in the lockup all day like you were, but
no, you're right.
Is that okay? And is that it's being billed? Let me get this right. As the most significant change since the Industrial Revolution. That's a bold claim.
That's a bold statement. I think I look at it one way is Canada has to be competitive with whatever the Americans are doing. They're being very aggressive in an energy transition. They've got a package that's some $500 billion. On a per capita basis, this is smaller. It's significant. It's important because I think there's been a lot of rhetoric around energy transition. This starts to put dollars behind it. I also think what's interesting is this time the government didn't try to create complicated instruments like new banks or new funds. It's doing via the tax system. So they've simplified a lot of things in this budget and tried to keep things simple. And I think they've struggled on execution over the last few years. And I think they may have learned some lessons. So we're seeing these kind of show up as investment tax credits. And we'll see whether there is take-up for these tax credits and whether investors respond and really support this energy transition. I think jury's still out, and I think we'll have to take a bit of a wait-and-see issue to decide if this was enough and effectively targeted.
Did you get any sense of that in the lockup, whether investors will respond to these tax credits?
Yeah, it's hard to tell right now. I think the benefit, I met with Minister Champagne in the lockup, and he talked about flexibility and keeping things simple. And I think that the opportunity is for money to flow more quickly. You're not waiting for new legislation. You're not waiting for a new organization to be established. The government's not picking winners. It's really allowing the market to make its own investments, and then essentially the government's trying to help support those by lowering the risk or increasing the return to a risk-adjusted return for those investors and trying to encourage this energy transition. It's a tried and tested way to do this. It's certainly a lot easier, a lot more manageable than some of the complex mechanisms they've tried in the past. And so we didn't see anything about clusters or new banks created. It was relatively straightforward, writing checks, doing tax credits, things that kind of inject money relatively quickly.
All right, Sahir Khan from the University of Ottawa's Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Thanks so much for that. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Donna.
All right, let's go back to Mercedes and David. David, Talk a bit, if you can, about the balance the finance minister is trying to strike here. It's not easy, you know, spending to help people cope with the cost of living, but not spending so much that it drives up inflation. How confident is Chrystia Freeland that she's got it right?
Well, she's certainly talking quite confident. She had a press conference inside the lockup with us in which she talked about the challenge, and she certainly talked about that in the budget speech as well, and I'm sure you'll hear about this from her in the days ahead. It is a bit of a tricky thing in the sense that she's trying to accomplish really three things. First of all, there are millions of Canadians fighting with the effects of inflation right now, and millions of Canadians need some help right now. And that costs some money. Not that much money, as I mentioned, just about a couple of $2 billion for this one-time rebate. So that's one thing, the needs right now of Canadians. Then she has got to set the economy on this new green path to the future. You were talking to Sahir about that. Taria had some points about that. That will cost some money. Most of that money, I should point out, those billions for green tech investments, back-ended in the 5-year sort of budget timeline, most of them coming after the next election. And then the third thing she's got to do is really try to shore up the country's fiscal foundation for these expected headwinds we may have, for a slowdown in the economy, lower revenues for the government, and higher costs in terms of EI. So three things that she's trying to accomplish. She's done it, and Sahir was so helpful with us in the lockup. He was guiding us through the numbers that it really is prudent, some of the steps she's take. There is, quote, downside risk in the sense that the economy will not perform as well as possible. Tax revenue won't be as much as possible. But it's sort of some modest objectives sort of on each front, whether it's green tech or this one-time rebate. As you said, $467 bucks is going to help people, but a lot of families with 4 or 5 kids, or a lot of families of 4 or 5 kids. I couldn't imagine feeding them right now, but there you go. Costs a lot of money. The grocery bill has gone up, and where does that go? So, so there you go. Freeland's. I think she's been fighting in cabinet against some of her colleagues who want to spend more. She's definitely been on the side in the last couple of budgets for a little more restraint.
Yeah, well, I think being finance minister means a lot of saying no, right?
Dr. No, that's what Paul Martin used to be called, absolutely.
Mercedes, I should say we're hoping to hear from the opposition, their reaction to this budget. We haven't quite yet, but if we get that, we will go to it. But Mercedes, there's always lots of politics wrapped up in the way governments decide to spend money. What do you think the political calculation is here for the finance minister, for the Liberals?
Well, there's really two calculations that they have to make. Number one is to keep Jagmeet Singh and the NDP on board, because without that, they can't maintain government. But they've kept their promise to the NDP to put dental care in here. Jagmeet Singh had indicated he planned to support this budget. The Conservatives have said they planned to vote against it unless there was significant cuts to taxes that are not in here. But Donna, what this really is, as David was saying, and Taria was alluding to as well, is a consumer budget. And it's very thin. David kindly lent me his. I'm going to show you. Okay, this is thinner than most Harper government budgets, who were very low spenders. This is really targeted at a consumer audience about sending the message of fiscal restraint, about small but popular programs that don't cost the government a lot. So it is ultimately, as it always is, a political document, but this is really one with a bit of a retail political feel to it. There are not big surprises in it. There are some things that we thought might be missing that are, for example, like defense spending. The money that's in here is the money that was already laid out, $1.4 billion for JTF2, money for F-35s and the infrastructure to go around them, but it's certainly not getting us to that 2% of defense spending that NATO and the Americans want. I've been told the Defense Policy Review, which will look at what we're going to buy, has been pushed after the budget deliberately, so we won't see that till 2024, and that might also be when we see pharmacare. Be a great time to drop that if you might be going into an election in 2025.
All right. Well, thank you both for all of that. We're going to come back to you in Global National in a little bit. But before we leave our viewers now, just a quick recap of what's been in this federal budget. The biggest line item on the affordability front is $2.5 billion in spending for a GST rebate aimed at lower-income households. The one-time rebate is expected to deliver $467 directly to a family of 4, $234 to individuals without children. Ottawa's investing $18.5 billion on spending spending and tax credits to boost the so-called green economy. And the budget also predicts the Canadian economy will enter what's called a shallow recession in 2023. For our viewers across the Global Television Network, our coverage concludes for now. If you're watching us online on BC1 or streaming on a smart device, please stay with us. Our coverage will continue in just a moment, and we'll have full analysis of the budget. I'll speak one-on-one with the Finance Minister coming up on Global National tonight. For now, I'm Donna Friesen. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Tell us how Canadians can rely on a single word of her budget forecast.
The live shot from Ottawa right now from Parliament, where Chrystia Freeland has just delivered the 2023 budget in Parliament. We'll break down what it means to Canadians struggling with their own finances these days as debate continues there. Good afternoon, and thanks very much for joining us. I'm Chris Galis. Keith Baldry will be with me for the next hour as we go through the takeaways of a budget many are hoping will help with the affordability and the inflation pain people across the country are feeling. Keith joins me now from the legislature in Victoria. Keith, good to have you with us as always. What jumped out at you in what we just heard about what's in this budget and the kind of support Canadians are going to get to deal with added inflation costs?
Yeah, so evidently obvious, I think, that Chrystia Freeland, the Finance Minister, is a very interesting balancing act she has to perform here. She doesn't want to spend so much money that's going to cause inflation to continue to rise, but she has to answer the affordability question. So there's a bit of a consumer tone to this budget, I think. You've got the GST tax credit for low and middle income Canadians. That's more than $2 billion, and it works out to about $467 for people with 2 kids, a little less for people with childless and for seniors. So that's probably the biggest consumer takeaway. But spending continues to be up. The notion of tackling the deficit or eliminating the deficit disappeared a long time ago. Even though last year's budget projected a surplus 5 years from now that surplus is turning into almost a $15 billion deficit 5 years from now. So the notion of deficit financing is with us for some time. I think a child of the pandemic, when all spending and revenue estimates went out the window. No big surprises in today's budget from Minister Freeland. A lot of this, of course, is leaked ahead of time. That's a tradition that goes back decades, Chris. So we knew what was coming in terms of that grocery GST. Also, a big emphasis on clean technology, greening the economy, $20 billion over 5 years. But a lot of that takes the form of tax credits, and that's always a bit of a murky area there as well. So bottom line, a balancing act. I think she's got a few nuggets in there that will please the NDP. An increase of the dental plan. Anybody who earns income under $90,000 and is not otherwise insured now will be given dental plan coverage. So there's things in there to keep the NDP happy, which means this budget's going to pass the House. Yeah, and that means test also includes that so-called grocery rebate, too. It's not just a check that's handed out to every Canadian. It's those who have filed a tax return in the last couple of years. And as David Akin pointed out in our previous coverage, in our national program, there are a lot of people on the lower end of the income scale who simply don't file taxes, and they're missing out on this benefit. Excellent point. That's been my point I've been making for some time. There's a big difference between getting a check in the mail, which you can go to the bank and cash and spend today, rather than waiting for the end of the year or for your tax return. As you say, Chris, many people in the low income scale have no incentive to file a tax return because they just can't afford to pay more taxes if that's what's required by filing the tax return. So tax credits don't quite get it done, which I think have to be viewed differently than outright spending commitments, whether it's in terms of this a grocery bill or whether it's greening the economy and green technology. Giving companies money up front rather than just tax credits is a fundamentally different proposition. It sure is. Keith, we'll keep you on the line here and we'll come back to you in a little bit, but I do want to bring in Global's chief political correspondent nationally, David Akin, who was in budget lockup all morning
Joining us now from Parliament Hill, David, thanks very much. What struck you in what you read in budget lockup and what you saw delivered from the finance minister today?
Well, the first thing is, Chris, I spent all day in the budget lockup and I've got some news, but Keith has got it all in about half an hour and he didn't spend all day in the budget lockup. He's got it right on in Keith's comment there that this is sort of a consumer-focused budget, even though there isn't a lot of money for consumers. That's what the government is calling a grocery rebate. Don't be taken in by the government spin. You know, you could be living in a retirement home last year, never ever bought a grocery because it's purchased for you, and you'd still get this rebate. Or you can spend it on anything you want. It doesn't have to be spent on groceries, but it is only I shouldn't say only $467. That is a lot of money to a lot of people, but given the pace of food inflation, it may not make the biggest dent. But there's a lot of things that the government did that I think people are going to be talking about that aren't going to cost the government a single penny, but that go to some of the affordability issues. Let me run through a couple of them. The government says it wants to cut down on junk fees. What are junk fees? These are the little added on service charges if you go to a rock concert or an event and you know the ticket price is $24 and you look at your bill and there's these additional charges by the person who's selling the tickets. The government wants to outlaw that. How about extra charges for baggage when you're flying? The government wants to prohibit those. Roaming charges on your cell phone bill, the government wants to prohibit those. They're calling these junk fees. I think that will be popular with consumers, may not be popular with some business organizations, but we'll see where that goes. One of the other things, too, is this is something Europe has already done. In Europe, the European government has said enough with a lightning cable, a USB-B, a USB-D, a 3-prong cord, you name it, to try and charge all your devices. The European Parliament has said there's going to be one cord that rules them all, the USB-C cord. Today, the Government of Canada has said we're going to explore the same idea, going to a single kind of cord to recharge all your devices. Now, since Europe's already done USB-C, you can almost bet that Canada's going to go down that particular road. But again, there's something where we're reducing electronic waste. You don't have to buy so many darn cords. The other thing, too, we want to point out, enshrining in law the right to repair. So often manufacturers of refrigerators or electronic gadgets, they won't allow you to repair them. You'll just have to trade it in and buy a new one. That's wasteful. It's also expensive. And so what the government is saying, you will have the legal right to say, no, I like this fridge. I just need a new condenser in it. Please repair it. So the right to repair, also part of the budget, doesn't cost them a penny, but may be popular with consumers. So again, all these little things, a consumer-focused budget without actually giving consumers much extra money.
As a guy who has repaired his own washer and dryer a few times, David, I know how important that is to me and to a lot of other Canadians, and that'll go over pretty well. Thank you very much. We appreciate the coverage you did on the federal program as well, and always a pleasure to talk to you, David Akin in Ottawa. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, I'll bring Keith back in for a moment, too, because David raised a good point about how Canada looks to other nations and other jurisdictions for guidance in some cases for some of these policies, and that one that includes setting a standard for charging cords. As you know, as aggravating as that can be, that is something that kind of jumps out at people when they look at what's in the budget and how does it directly impact me.
Yeah, not exactly your traditional budget item.
No.
I've covered a lot of budgets over the years. I've certainly never seen a plug-in reference to have a common cord. But again, reflective of the new technology that's captured everyone's lives. It is frustrating sometimes when some cords work on some devices and not on others. So that's an indication, I think, of taking a deeper dive into the consumer aspect of this. As David pointed out, there's no real big single item here in terms of relieving consumer spending, but there's a bunch of little things. And it was very interesting. He talked about the fees at airports and the fees you pay on rock concert tickets and such. And that applies right across the board to so many items. And that's going to have an interesting impact on consumers. So it's like a little consumer budget rather than a big ticket consumer budget. I think the dental plan also is one that's going to get some attention because the threshold here is actually quite high. It's $90,000 income. That's about double the average income out there. So a lot of people are going to qualify for this who aren't covered in subsequent in other dental plans. So again, go back to the balancing act. You don't want to spend so much money that you really allow inflation to continue to rise, but you got to spend some money on the human side and help people out at a time when they need help the most.
And getting rid of some of those little aggravations might be small on the cost scale, but have a big impact in terms of people's acceptance of it.
And here's one, it didn't get a lot of attention. We always joke from time to time about the price of beer. And politicians in the past have run on budgets and table budgets, even run on election campaigns. Bill Van der Zam back in the 80s ran on a promise to reduce the price of beer. Well, it's not going down in this budget, but it's interesting. On April 1st, the tax on alcohol was supposed to go up 6.7%. It's been knocked down to 2 points now, 2%. That's a big decline in a tax that was going to hit a lot of people. Going to pick up your case of beer, it's not going to cost as much now as it was just a few days ago.
Again, taking care of those little aggravations. Keith, thanks very much. Don't go anywhere. We'll have you coming back here in a moment as I turn the sound off on another monitor I have in this studio. I want to bring in Sahir Khan now, the Executive Vice President at the University of Ottawa Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. You might have seen him on the program with Donna just a few moments ago. Sahir, thanks very much for joining us. You know, the talk here is about balance. That was what Chrystia Freeland said, and doing enough to help Canadians weather this economic storm and the price of high inflation without doing too much to contribute to inflation. Do you think that balance has been struck here?
Yeah, Chris, I think I do. And I think one way to look at it is this budget aims to spend about $67 billion since the last fiscal update over the next 5 years. But each year, you know, we've got an economy that's going to be around, you know, close to $3 trillion. So the amount of money that the federal government plans to spend is really kind of a drop in the bucket, a drop in the ocean in terms of that pressure. This measure for the tax credit is really targeting the kind of the most stubborn item in inflation, which has been food prices. It may not sound a lot, you know, overall, but you know, to people who really need it, it's probably a meaningful amount of money. And I think for the 11 million people who could be eligible, it kind of reminds me of the GST credit, the GST cut that the Harper government did. You know, every time you're at Timmy's, you kind of remember that you're paying a little less. And I think that's going to be something that resonates not just from an affordability point of view, but politically. And that may explain why the base is so broad. I also think that this government's probably going to have to watch this issue. And if inflation comes down, as economists expect, this will become less of an issue. But, you know, they may have to reconsider measures later in the year for the fiscal update, because this is not going to go away. And the inflation that's built up over the last few years is baked into our household budgets. It's going to still be expensive, more expensive to run our households. And the headline number may come down, but it's going to take a long time before wages kind of catch up to all of that. So people will still struggle. We're still going to feel this for a long time to come.
So here, these are unusual times for any government trying to balance a budget. As I know you're aware, we're coming out of the pandemic. There's the high inflation, higher borrowing costs. The models, the economic stability that we've relied on for generations, it seems to be more of a guessing game these days. So given that, maybe you can frame for us, if you can, just the circumstances that this government has had to face in trying to come up with a budget that's going to help but not do too much. It's unusual, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if you think about just how unusual it is, you've got a government coming off this pandemic, which, you know, by its nature is absolutely unique. And then you get a bit of time to catch your breath, and now we're heading into a softening economy. You've got the war in Ukraine. You've got supply chains that still haven't kind of caught up after the war, after the pandemic, and now they're having to deal with inflation, softening economy, all at the same time. So for the finance minister, this isn't a balancing act. All the while, you're trying to show that your books are going to be fiscally sustainable. The last fiscal update, we saw, a potential track to a balanced budget. Which they're showing, and show that they're broadly fiscally sustainable over kind of a long-term 30-year period, and they're doing that. And I think they're using the available room that they have to do the kind of measures like dental care, clean tech, and the GST rebate as a way to kind of support those sectors and the people that are kind of in need to keep Canada competitive and keep those that are struggling, help keep their head above water.
When you take a look at some of the things in this budget, were there any surprises to you? Was there anything that really jumps out as something that Canadians are going to look at and say, wow, that is going to help me? I know you mentioned the grocery rebate a little bit, $467. If you have 2 children in your household, it goes down if you have fewer.
No. They were taking.
Is that significant enough to have to make a difference for Canadians?
I think for those who really need it, it has impact. I think it ends up being a windfall for those that maybe don't. But the reality is, inflation has built into all of our household budgets, and our incomes actually, don't always keep pace. So I think this is actually going to be meaningful to just about everybody who gets it at some level, but particularly for those that really need it. But I also think that there's more to it than just the one measure. There are lots of little things that happen in this budget, and David Akin kind of talked about it, that don't cost the government a lot, but are kind of a nuisance. And maybe the government can start to use some of its power, its moral suasion, to compel banks to maybe ease up on mortgage refinancing, to make our life with technology and repairs a little easier. So lots of little kind of consumer-friendly measures that maybe take away some of the irritations in our life. And I think this is kind of the things that we haven't really seen in budgets in the past. And it was always like, there's a problem, let's allocate a large sum of money at it and hope that there's a good result. This seems to be a lot more measured, a lot more targeted.
If you spend any time on Twitter, as I do, you know there are a lot of little aggravations in Canadians' lives, those things that the government appears to be addressing in this budget, and we'll see if that resonates with Canadians and with voters. Sahir, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Chris.
All right, that's Sahir Khan, the Executive Vice President at the University of Ottawa Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. I want to bring in Keith Baldry once again, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we both saw in some of the information that came out of the budget, and particularly as it pertains to clean energy. There's a fairly sizable portion of this budget that is going to go to the transition to a cleaner, greener economy, about $18.5 billion, almost $20 billion over 5 years. What are the impacts, do you think, in some of the provinces, including ours, that are really dependent on resource extraction?
Yeah, this is a very interesting part of the budget, driven in part by U.S. President Joe Biden's administration of this massive $1.7 trillion investment over a number of years to green their economy. Ours is a much more modest $20 billion. Remains to be seen how this is going to play out. It's designed, or it's aimed at increasing the amount of electricity, hydrogen, also critical mineral extraction, things like nickel, for example. Basically, if you want to have green technology, you've got to build it. And that means using minerals that currently right now BC or Canada does not have a massive access to. So it's interesting, electric vehicles, just as an example. The BC government and various governments across Canada have targets. In BC, it's to have 90% of all the vehicles sold in BC to be electric vehicles by the year 2030. Sounds great. Who's going to build those vehicles, though? You need the minerals to build the electronic car battery are things like cobalt, lithium, and nickel. While China, state-owned China companies have cornered the market on all those minerals. They own the companies in Congo and Indonesia where these minerals are found. There are some of these minerals in Canada. That's why you're going to see much more of an investment to extract those resources out of the ground and have them contribute to the green economy. Also, in terms of electricity, it's unclear how the electricity is going to be developed. In BC, we develop electricity largely through the use of hydroelectric dams, Site C being the big one. Someone's talking in my ear here that is very distracting. Anyways, so the amount of dams that may have to be built could be significant if the electric targets here are high, and they seem to be high. I've got a column out this week using Rick McCandless, who we've used from time to time as an expert, as intervener status at the BC Utilities Commission. He points out, just on our LNG projects that are supposed to go ahead in BC, we would need the equivalent of 3 or 4 more Site C dams just to electrify those mammoth projects. Quite apart from electric vehicles, which is another huge daunting task. How do you get 350,000 vehicles, and that's the number, onto BC roads in the next 7 years when we're really building them at a snail's pace because we don't control the supply chain? So that's a big unknown part of this green technology aspect. We don't have control over the supply chain that is so vital to accomplishing so many things set out associated with green technology.
The other one, too, and you'll remember the chancellor from Germany here and the federal government signing agreements to provide clean hydrogen to Germany and other European markets. Right now, there isn't really the infrastructure to provide that, and the amount of electricity that will be needed to crack those water molecules and provide that clean hydrogen, if that's presumably hydropower, is going to be a big challenge as well, and a big draw.
Yeah, and there's a lot of uncertainty with this. There's lofty targets are set and grand promises are made, but then you take a big step back and say, okay, how do we get there? We get there through nuts and bolts and bits and pieces, and those things have to be put together. And some of those pieces don't exist at ready availability in Canada because we just don't have access to them. So it's going to be hard to see how we achieve a number of these targets, whether it's set out in today's budget or in other budgets across Canada. But again, Chrystia Freeland has set some ambitious goals here, but there's not a lot of detail associated with the green technology side of this. It largely consists of tax credits, and as we've discussed, there's a big difference between tax credits and actual cash on the barrelhead. So we'll see how that develops over the next 5 years.
All right, thanks very much, Keith. Obviously, some of the federal party leaders are speaking with giving their reaction to what they've heard in the budget. Here's Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet with his comments.
Et on arrive avec un budget qui est à très peu de choses près un copier-coller de l'énoncé économique de l'automne dernier. On va disposer tout de suite de certains éléments fondamentaux. Nous avions déjà établi que nous n'acceptions pas l'entente entre Ottawa et les provinces et le Québec, que les provinces et le Québec ont été obligés d'accepter, sinon c'était rien pantoute et qu'elles n'en avaient pas les moyens. Pour nous, les transferts en santé tels qu'ils ont été négociés sont inadéquats. Et à défaut de rencontrer la demande des provinces et du Québec à hauteur de 35 %, nous ne sommes pas satisfaits. Il n'y a absolument rien dans ce budget pour les aînés de 65 à 75 ans pour aller rejoindre leurs collègues de 75 ans et plus, ni même une augmentation digne de ce nom, incluant pour les gens âgés de 75 ans et plus. Il n'y a aucune réforme de l'assurance-emploi, aucune bonification pour les gens qui cotisent et qui n'ont accès à rien, c'est-à-dire 60 % des cotisants du régime d'assurance-emploi.
Need to apologize. Obviously, we do not have the translation for Yves-François Blanchet ready at the moment. We are working on that, and we'll get it for you as quickly as we can. And it sounds like maybe we've fix that gremlin. Let's listen in.
That had been budgeted and not spent about $40 billion in obsolete credits. This year, they are announcing a deficit of $40 billion. One thing cancels the other. In the facts, the federal government wants to announce deficits. The second fundamental element, she uses the fiscal imbalance, that is to say, the marginal sums that this clears, to make energy investments, which can become hideaways for greenwashing, all the more relevant in that they are used through tax credits, and we don't know who will be using them. Some will go into carbon capture. We still don't know how they work. Some in grey energy made with Western Canada oil and gas, and potential financing for nuclear energy, which in the Canadian text is not a clean energy. So there's a significant portion of those $21 billion that will be indirectly supporting oil companies through tax credits. Thanks to this alleged fiscal imbalance, the government is taking in too much money in taxes with respect to its government obligations, whereas the provinces do not take in enough money to fund their own obligations. The government is announcing that within 30 to 40 years, it will have eliminated the federal debt. Whereas, according to the parliamentary budget director, in 30 to 40 years, some Canadian provinces will be going bankrupt, and the finances of all Canadian provinces will have deteriorated to an irrecoverable level. It is thanks to this mechanism that the federal government is centralizing and literally buys powers that belong to provinces. Final observation. This is not an election-focused budget, but is a budget that dangerously creates the conditions for an election-focused budget in 2024. What mark do you give this budget and why? I can't comment on the specific relevance of marking a budget, but is this a pass mark? No. Obviously not. Maybe I would give it an E, because it doesn't take into account the economic reality. And we are told inflation will cure itself, and we will avoid a recession, or if not, we'll see. Now, there's one benefit. There's a significant margin for maneuver in case of a contingency, but the budget doesn't put in place the preventive measure that would allow for Canada's and Quebec's economies to be ready to resist a recession. It's a short-sighted budget that mustn't have taken long to plan how so thin it is. I've known budgets at the Quebec National Assembly where the desks were groaning under the weight of documents. This is a thin budget.
Why not? Because we said that we would not support a budget that would not acknowledge the fact that the provinces in Quebec need 35% of the total budget in healthcare to support the system and make it minimally good enough for the services it has to provide. With this budget, it is clear that this will not happen. If we take the example of Quebec, about $1 billion a year will not make a difference in a budget that is already of something like $72 or $74 billion a year in healthcare. So it is not significant, and it is not enough, and it will not justify our support.
What do you think of the huge chunk of funding that's going toward dental care? Was it more than you expected to see?
This is about what we expected to see. The big difference is that they are creating a centralized agency to manage this program. We will see what will happen with this when time comes, and how this will be implemented in Quebec.
Pour les Québécois, c'est quoi la mesure selon vous dans ce budget-là qui est positive puis que c'est un bon coup pour le Québec?
For you, what is something positive for Quebec in this budget? There is one measure that minimally matches what not just us but everybody is asking for, which is to give a little money to the most vulnerable people through the additional GST refund by way of check, and it's a breath of fresh air. But what these people need in a context where, yes, of course, inflation will be slowing down, but the price of food and products will remain high, these people needed a permanent measure, a substantial and lasting increase in their purchasing power of the most vulnerable people.
That a lot of the initiatives you feel are sort of not for really green projects. They're not actually, in your view, the right projects that should be invested on doing help the environment. So tell me about
carbon sequestration, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Capture.
Carbon capture and
carbon
storage.
Capture.
But sequestration.
Carbon capture is something that does not work and is provided essentially for the oil companies to keep going in drilling. If we are hiding some support for nuclear power in those initiatives that are intended to help create a more productive electricity network throughout Canada, then it is not a good thing, because in the Canadian context, nuclear energy is not green, is not clean. And this idea of what we call in French hydrogen gris, gray hydrogen, you translate it the same way? It is something which is produced with gas. It's all measures which we cannot measure precisely how much will go to this, and it will be implemented through tax credits, so we will never know who will have benefited from it.
pouvoir bénéficier de milliards de dollars pour des travaux pour améliorer ses infrastructures.
Billions of dollars for infrastructure work or new dams. What do you think of that measure in particular? It's one of the things that we really scratched our head about because we don't know enough. We don't know enough how Hydro-Quebec will react, how it will be qualified, how will Hydro-Quebec's future project. Okay, I make a comparison with the carbon exchange. When we created the carbon exchange between Quebec and California, at the beginning, Quebec was performed so well that it couldn't create new projects to reduce greenhouse gases. California was at the right moment, so Quebec sent a lot of capital to California. Quebec is a giant in producing green energy, that new projects may not be as many as for Quebec as for other places that maybe were only waiting for that, in particular the Ontario nuclear industry. Does Hydro-Quebec need congratulations or further help? We'll have to make sure it's far too preliminary so that we can make a specific analysis. We don't want the federal government to create unfair competition for Hydro-Quebec. Hydro-Quebec has reached the scope and the prestige that we know without any help from the federal government, not a penny. Now the federal government says, well, we will help competitors to Hydro-Quebec. For us in Quebec, okay, well, where were you when Hydro-Quebec was created? So why would you be supporting today those who want to muscle into markets that ought to be Hydro-Quebec's?
Foreign interference, $50 million to help the RCMP investigate and speak with diaspora communities, and then $13 million to create a new counter foreign interference office. Are you pleased to see this in the budget? Is there more that you would have liked to see, and what?
A budget is not the place where we can measure and analyze the relevancy of such measures. This is a number. Beside it, there's a word. I want to know the meaning, the way this will work. The amount of money which is supposed to be invested in such an issue is interesting, but rather small. But what, and it's always the same thing, what will be the mandate of any such new institution? The federal government does not use well the institutions already existing, and it does not put in place an inquiry about those intrusion of China into Canadian politics. So I do not see how a word in a budget with a number would make so much of a difference. If you want to know what should be done with that money, first start with an inquiry, independent, with some measures proposed at the end of it.
I want to hear your answer in...
Okay, there you have it. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet. Probably no surprise, not entirely happy with what he heard in the budget today from Chrystia Freeland. Concerned about the use of tax credits to reach climate targets. Says the federal government is asking too much from taxpayers and not leaning on provinces to take care of their own financial responsibility. Does he give it a pass mark? He was asked if he was grading it as a report card, what kind of pass mark would he give it? He says, no, I wouldn't pass it. It would get an E, which in French is échoué, the equivalent of an F in the English school system. So that is the reaction from Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet. The other party leaders we are still waiting to hear from, most notably Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, NDP Jagmeet Singh as well. So let's talk about that topic, the climate change, climate goals that were included in this budget. And we'll bring in a special guest. Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood is with the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives, watching today's budget coverage with interest, I'm sure, especially, Hadrian, what's in it to encourage the transition to a greener economy and address climate change? Thanks very much for being with us, first of all. Hadrian, what did you find in the government's message today?
Well, thanks for having me. The big thing on climate is a huge package of investment tax credits for the clean economy, things like clean tech, clean manufacturing, clean electricity. There's about $56 billion in this budget. You add up some things in the last few budgets, and we're looking at about $80 billion in these investment tax credits. So those are subsidies, those are incentives to the private sector mainly to build out Canada's clean economy.
Is that enough to help push forward this generational transitional change that the experts tell us is necessary in not only our economy but the global economy to address climate change? Will it have a very real effect?
It absolutely will have a real effect. When you combine all these incentives with the carbon pricing system we have across the country, it's a lot of money, and it makes for a very favorable investment environment, and that was a big concern following the U.S.'s Inflation Reduction Act. Could Canada compete in clean tech? And it looks like it can. I think the big concern is what happens if the market doesn't step up. The federal government has basically asked the private sector to take the wheel and solve the climate change problem for us, and I'm not sure what the federal government's plan is if the provinces and the private sector don't deliver.
Is there enough in the transition, in the green economy, to supplant, replace eventually the reliance that the Canadian economy has on resource extraction and specifically carbon energy?
Absolutely, the potential is there, both in terms of job creation, economic
Hadrian,
productivity,
hold your thought on that. I'm so sorry, I've got to cut you off. We'll come back to you on that, but right now here's Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre talking about his reaction to today's budget.
L'inflation. Le Parti conservateur a demandé trois choses: que le gouvernement mette en place des réductions de coûts pour éliminer l'inflation, les réductions de taxes pour que les Canadiens puissent ramener davantage chez eux, et troisièmement, d'éliminer la paperasserie pour bâtir davantage de maisons et rendre le logement plus abordable. Les libéraux n'ont rien fait pour ces demandes-là. Ça n'a pas de bon sens. Ça n'a pas de bon sens. Les Canadiens ne peuvent plus payer la facture pour cette coalition coûteuse qui augmente les taxes, les impôts et l'inflation. Et c'est pour ça que le Parti conservateur votera contre ce budget inflationniste. Thank you very much for being here today. Today's budget by the costly coalition of the NDP and Liberals is a full frontal attack on the paychecks of hardworking Canadians. It equals $4,200 per family in new government spending. That's more inflation, more taxes, and more costs for everyday people. There's no common sense. We asked for three things. The government should have brought home lower prices by eliminating inflationary deficits and carbon taxes, brought home powerful paychecks with lower taxes that reward hard work, and brought homes people could afford by getting rid of the government gatekeepers to speed up and lower the cost of building permits. Those are the three demands we put forward, and those three demands have not been met. This is an attack on the hardworking people of this country, and that is why Conservatives will be voting no. Instead, we will vote to bring home powerful paychecks, bring home lower costs, and bring homes that people can afford. It's common sense. Let's bring it home.
A big chunk of the money goes toward, obviously, dental coverage. This is not something that the government ran on as a mandate. What do you make of this, that, you know, a huge amount of taxpayers' money is going toward this initiative when they didn't run on this issue?
Well, they didn't run on any of this. They've once again broken their promises, and they've poured fuel on the inflationary fire. Low-income, working-class people will suffer the most as a result of this costly, inflationary, Liberal deficit. And Conservatives will fight once again to bring home lower prices by eliminating the inflationary carbon tax and deficits, bring home powerful paychecks by lowering taxes to reward hard work, and bring homes people can afford by getting the gatekeepers out of the way to build millions of new residents affordable for our workers.
Sur la taxe sur le carbone, on sait que le gouvernement fédéral veut maintenant lier les mains des prochains gouvernements pour vous empêcher.
Impossible. Justin Trudeau veut forcer les contribuables de payer
taxpayers to pay billions of dollars to major corporations, to major multinational corporations, if ever a future government were to reduce the cost of gasoline. Really? It's not possible. The Poilievre government will be bringing down the cost of gasoline and heating and all other projects, and will never be paying penalties to major companies that are Justin Trudeau's little friends.
Why is it impossible for him to compensate companies?
Let's just follow how out of touch Justin Trudeau is. Justin Trudeau believes Canadian taxpayers should make multi-billion-dollar payments to powerful multinational corporations if ever a future government should reduce taxes on gas and home heating. That's what he believes. He believes the little old lady who can't heat her home and pay for her food should have to pay higher taxes to fund a multinational corporation if in any event, in any future scenario, we should lower taxes on energy. That is an outrageous attack on our working class. Another example of Justin Trudeau taking from the have-nots to give to the have-yachts.
How much of this do you think is related to the NDP deal that they have, and what do you think of the NDP saying, we're supporting this because we've gotten what we need out of it?
We have an NDP government that is running massive inflationary deficits, bankrupting households, keeping young people living in their parents' basements, forcing seniors to choose between heating and eating. There is literally only one party that is championing the hardworking people who contribute and make this country work. We, as Conservatives, will fight for a Canada that works for the people who work. It's common sense. We need to bring it home.
There you have it. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre saying today's budget is a full frontal attack on Canadian taxpayers, pouring fuel on the inflationary fire, and we'll get reaction to that, of course, coming up. But I want to bring back in Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, again with the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives, watching today's budget coverage, I'm sure. Were you able to hear what Poilievre said there, Hadrian?
I was able to hear that, yeah.
Okay, let me get your reaction to how he phrased his response to this budget.
Well, I mean, I think there's perhaps some misleading statements in there about how carbon pricing works and how that affects Canadians' pocketbooks. We know carbon pricing is a very effective policy, and because of rebates, it actually makes most families better off. So it's not really an inflationary driver at all. He also mentioned something, he didn't use it by name, but contracts for differences, which is a way of ensuring that carbon pricing survives a future government. And of course, I can understand why his government would, or his party would be skeptical of that kind of policy, but it's actually very good economics. It costs the government nothing as long as we maintain carbon pricing, and it can encourage a lot of productive investment into clean tech.
And in one line or less, how does this budget work for Canadians who are hoping for a greener and better climate-friendly economy?
Well, the good news is it's going to push a lot of money into the clean economy. It's going to create jobs, green jobs across the country, especially with good labor conditions attached to some of these policies. It doesn't tackle fossil fuels, and that's the other part of the puzzle that we have to figure out.
All right. Hadrian, thank you very much for your time. Again, that's Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We appreciate your expertise today. Okay, I'll bring Keith back in. Let's talk a little bit about what we heard from Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, and his take on Justin Trudeau's budget and what he's asking of Canadian taxpayers.
Yeah, absolutely no surprise in Mr. Poilievre's reaction. I mean, he's the leader of the official opposition. He's going to oppose the budget. That's what oppositions do. So there was never any chance of Poilievre backing this budget. No matter what was in it, there was going to be a vote of no from his caucus. I mean, that's the way our system works by and large. Interesting discussion you just had with Hadrian there. This issue of carbon and Poilievre talked about this as well, about how carbon taxes, carbon pricing works. In last year's budget was this schedule, and it's in BC's budget this year, of the significant increase in the carbon taxes that the Trudeau government has mandated on the provinces, and it continues with the budget we saw today. So on April 1st, the carbon tax goes from $50 per ton to $65 per ton. And over the next 7 years, it's going to go from $50 per ton to $170. That's more than triple. So you start applying that carbon tax to all sorts of things, not least of which is the price at the pump. So over the next 7 years, when you fill up your car, you're going to be paying more than three times as much carbon tax as you pay right now. That's always a sensitive issue, quite apart from the fact, just what we got now with carbon taxes. So over time, And the Trudeau government has sort of locked this in, binding the hands of other governments, which is what Poilievre was talking about there. They can't change it. But I wonder whether you're going to see a taxpayer backlash on this type of taxation. It's the only tax that is guaranteed to go up by a significant amount each and every year. It's not like the sales tax going up or income tax rates going up. Those are largely been untouched for decades. This is the one tax now embedded into our financial system and our daily lives that's going to go up each and every year. And it's not just the price at the pump, it's the price you pay for heating your home, for example, whether it's natural gas or oil, unless you have the benefit of electricity. But again, these costs are also passed on to businesses who will increase their prices to pay for the carbon tax. So it's one tax that's very unique, and we see it on front and center in today's budget as well. It's a sign of the times. The carbon tax appears to be here to stay, but it's not the same carbon tax that we saw when Gordon Campbell introduced it a number of years ago. It's becoming a much more expensive thing over the next 7 years.
The government factors in, though, the carbon tax rebates that are supposed to go up in lockstep with the increases in the carbon tax. I guess the criticism is they're just not enough to make up for.
Well, not only that, there's an open question, are they having the desired impact? I mean, we're just like every other jurisdiction, we're not hitting our climate change targets. And no one can state with any realistic reasoning and facts that we are going to hit our climate change targets, whether it's BC or Canada or pick a country. No one has hit their targets. Everyone's bringing in different measures, carbon taxes and such, but nothing seems to really be having an impact on the consumer. This is supposed to curb your behavior in terms of spending things that does have a carbon tax. And it hasn't resulted in less driving, and it hasn't resulted in lower fossil fuel use. In fact, fossil fuel use is going up, not down. So it's just an interesting part of the whole fight against climate change, whether certain things work better than others. I still think this electricity idea is a very bold one that's in today's budget. But the devil's in the details. You heard Blanchett, the leader of the BQ, talk about there's no detail about things like dams. Where are these things located? In BC, there's a huge fight over the Site C Dam. If we are required to build more dams, there's going to be more fights over issues like that.
No doubt, especially in BC. We like to fight over those things. All right, thanks very much, Keith. Of course, a big driver of inflation was gas prices. We mentioned that. We want to bring in Anne Gaviola now. She's in Toronto and has some more analysis on the federal budget and how the government plans to tackle inflation. Anne, thanks very much. Glad to have you on the program. What did you see in the budget that will provide relief from inflation for Canadians? Obviously, this grocery rebate is going to have some effect, even if for a lot of families it's limited.
Right, and it is a grocery rebate that's basically a top-up of an existing GST rebate. That's the biggest kind of affordability line item at $2.5 billion. But let's talk about what was in this budget before I tell you more about whether or not it's going to stoke that inflationary fire. A lot of people very concerned about this because, of course, inflation is at levels we haven't seen in many decades. So the Liberals were tasked with something that is not easy. They had to walk this fiscal and political tightrope where they had to announce things that people would get excited about without stoking inflationary fires. So we saw a big pivot. This was a budget that was described to me by several economists as a small one for the Liberals. There were a lot of low-cost measures in it, things that I would put under the bucket of consumer protection. So, for example, a crackdown on junk fees. So those extra items that are usually hidden and bump up the final price of things like a concert ticket, baggage costs. They want to rewrite the right to repair rules, so it doesn't matter what tech ecosystem your device is. We're not going to create more e-waste, and it's not going to cost you quite as much to get it repaired. More airline cancellation accountability, for example, and a crackdown and a modernization of federal laws around predatory lending. Those so-called payday loans are included in that. There was also a mortgage code of conduct promised. So a lot of these items, the priorities in this budget: healthcare, the green economy, expanded dental care, and as you mentioned, that one-time grocery rebate, which really has nothing to do with grocery spend. That was the single biggest line item in all of this. So one of the things that is interesting about this budget is it struck a kind of compromise. And I want to share with you some reaction I got from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And they talk about their excitement about the fact that, they applaud that there is a deal to lower credit card fees for small merchants, as promised in last fall's economic statement. However, they say the budget was a missed opportunity to provide relief to small businesses facing massive debt loads and cost increases. So there is that kind of compromise where they get some of what they wanted, but not everything.
And to the point of, is this inflationary? I've been speaking to several economists, including Craig Alexander, who is the former chief economist at TD and more recently at Deloitte. And he is now at his own shop, and he says, this government, he rightly points out, is projecting deficits for the next 5 years. The debt to GDP ratio increases and declines slowly. The fiscal positions suggest that this is inflationary. However, the question becomes how inflationary, and he says, I think it is only modestly inflationary and probably not enough to worry the Bank of Canada, is the bottom line.
Yeah, and really, at the end of the day, it's an educated guess, right? Nobody knows.
There are a lot of storm clouds brewing. Now, it is interesting as well in the budget. It does predict inflation is likely to get below 3% later this year and below 2%, which is the Bank of Canada's target, next year.
Well, consumers will be happy to hear that. Anne Gaviola in Toronto, thank you very much.
A little something for everyone.
Yeah, a little something for everyone. We love that. Thanks very much, Anne.
You bet.
Okay, now I want to bring in Dr. Alika Lafontaine, president of the Canadian Medical Association. Thanks very much for joining us, Dr. Fontaine.
Thanks for having me.
So you watched the delivery of the budget today. What jumps out? What did you like? What didn't you like?
So I think a lot of what we saw in the budget today was announced previously, but having managed many, many crises in my career, the most important thing in a crisis is predictability. So what I was actually excited about is everything that was announced actually made its way into the budget. One surprise that I think Canadians can be excited about is the Canada Dental Plan. That'll give access to dental care for millions of Canadians and hundreds of thousands of kids. As you know, it's not just about healthcare that physicians provide, but also dental providers and other allied providers that really matters to Canadians. And I think at the end of the day, we are well positioned to actually start to impact the number one priority of folks across the country, which is actually getting access to healthcare.
Talk about why that is such a priority. Dental health is overall health in a way, isn't it? And is that why this has become a priority for this government?
So I think that has some of the NDP fingerprints on it, but I would say that we have been worried as healthcare providers about a contraction of the healthcare system, and what we're actually seeing is an expansion to cover more types of care. As an anesthesiologist, it's not uncommon for me to be part of dental days where kids come in where they have sore teeth that need to be repaired and fixed, and having healthy teeth is really important for development of children and for adults, your ability to eat and remain consuming nutritious foods and other things. So I do think that the inclusion of dental care is really important, but going back to the announcements of the $198 billion that we've been talking about over the last month, I think it's quite exciting that we are now having the money available where we can start doing things that we've been hoping to do for the past few years. A lot of what we hoped for in the Canadian Medical Association advocacy has actually ended up in this budget.
And that is, to a lot of people, will be surprising, that a lot of the things that the medical community asked for actually has been delivered. Some provinces signed on reluctantly, in some cases, to the government's new healthcare funding plan. Does this budget include enough money to bolster a health system that many Canadians see as in crisis? Are we now coming out of that crisis in your mind?
So I think we're currently still in the midst of it. Until we start hearing from patients that their access has improved, until we start hearing from providers that their working environments have improved, I don't think we're through this crisis, but we are focused on the right things. And I think the federal government role is really to get stakeholders around the table. They've done that with the provinces and territories, with the strings attached, with the Canada Health Transfer and the need to share data, and with the bilateral agreements and the need to move towards pan-national licensure of providers through recognition of credentialing. I think we have people now seated. Now the important thing is to stay at the table and actually do the work to fix these problems.
All right. Well, we appreciate the work you put into that as the president of the Canadian Medical Association. Dr. Lafontaine, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All the best. All right. Federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh also reacting to the budget just moments ago. Here's what he had to say.
I can say I'm really proud that we were able to force this government to expand dental care. That's going to save money for families. That's going to mean that they're going to be able to take care of their teeth. And it's the biggest expansion of our healthcare system in a generation. It's truly going to be life-changing, and it's something that we're really proud of. That's going to really help Canadians in a real concrete way. And we're also proud that we forced this government to save people money, put more money back in their pockets with the GST rebate, which has been rebranded the grocery rebate. That's going to put money back in people's pockets. It's something that's going to make a difference in people's lives. And we're proud that we're able to do that. We're proud that we're, for the first time ever able to connect government investments to good wages. That's never been there before, having those strings attached that we're going to give supports and incentives to tackle the climate crisis only if there's guarantees for good wages, good pay, and support for union jobs. Like, that's something that's never been done before, and we're proud of that. We're also, on a number of areas, not satisfied that this government hasn't responded to the urgency of the housing crisis, that they haven't put in place changes to EI, given that we're up against a recession. So there's things that we're not satisfied by, but we're very proud of the work that we've been able to do.
So are you going to be supporting this budget is the big question.
Yes, we'll be supporting the budget. We're going to be supporting the expansion of dental care. We're going to be supporting giving people some money back in their pockets, helping them save money. We're going to be supporting the good wages tied to investments. We're going to be supporting the relief that Canadians deserve and that we force this government to deliver.
Where does this put you going forward in terms of leverage and supporting the Liberal government when most of the priorities have been introduced?
We're proud that we've been able to force this government to deliver things. And let me be very clear. There would not have been dental care in this budget but for New Democrats. There would not have been an expansion or a continuing of doubling the GST tax credit, which is the grocery rebate, but for the fact that we forced this government to deliver that. There wouldn't have been connections. There wouldn't have been clear ties between good jobs and investments in companies that are fighting the climate crisis, but for New Democrats. So we forced the government to do this. There's a number of things that are still need to be done by the end of this year. We still need to see anti-scab legislation. We still need to see pharmacare legislation, and we're going to make sure this government delivers those things as well by the end of the year.
What about the lack of a mention of pharmacare in this budget? That's a big ask for your party. I know they have until the end of the year to produce legislation according to your deal, but they didn't even mention it in the budget.
Well, they do have until the end of the year. I want to be very clear. We expect that legislation to be tabled by the end of this year and passed by the end of this year. That's according to our agreement, and we're going to force the government to do that. They have until the end of the year, and we're going to make sure they do that. It's very important to us, and we're going to continue to put pressure on the government to deliver on that very fundamental commitment that we forced them to make in our agreement. But it's a fundamental commitment for Canadians who want to see pharmacare happen.
Can you renegotiate of the agreement with the Liberals, since most of the stuff is completed? Can you, I guess moving forward, come up with new priorities to support them to 2025?
So we have a number of things that are still outstanding that have to be done by the end of this year. We're going to continue to put pressure on the government to deliver on those things, and those things remain to be seen. So we'll continue to fight hard to make sure those are delivered, like pharmacare, like the anti-scab legislation. And there's additional things that we fought for. One example of that is the GST rebate. That was not in the agreement. We pushed hard to have it delivered last year, and we pushed again to have it delivered again this year. So that's an example of something that we've been able to push for something outside of the agreement.
Any concerns about the deficit forecast in the budget?
We are concerned about making sure we spend in a prudent way. And there's certain things that we can't afford to continue doing. And we made it very clear we think it's irresponsible and something we can't continue to do to give billions of dollars to already profitable oil and gas companies. That's something we can't continue to do and we can't afford to do. We also can't continue to allow for tax loopholes that allow for billions of dollars of revenue to be lost so that we can't use that to invest properly in Canadians' programs that they need. So there's certain things that the government has to stop doing that are irresponsible and are wasteful that we will continue to push for this government to stop doing.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh taking some credit for many of the policies that are in this budget, including the climate policy, dental care. I'll bring Keith Baldry back in for final thoughts in the 52 seconds we have left to wrap this thing up, Keith.
Yeah, obviously it's going to pass the House. It has Jagmeet Singh's support, and the big takeaway for him, I think, is that dental plan expansion. That was really what the NDP's been pushing for some time. I don't think he's going to pull the plug on this Trudeau government, and Trudeau will continue to call his bluff on certain issues and not meet the NDP's demands on a number of fronts. But Jagmeet Singh can take a bit of a claim of victory here of getting that dental plan expanded. As you and I and guests have talked throughout the show, Chris, I think it's very much a sort of a niche budget in terms of little things here and there for specific parts of the population to meet their needs or aggravations, whether it's devices and plugins or whether it's the price of groceries. So a little bit for everyone, not a big thing for anyone though. But again, party's going to vote along traditional lines and it's going to pass the House.
Perfect way to wrap it up, Keith. Thanks very much. As always, pleasure to work with you. And that wraps up today's 2023 federal budget special. You can watch for full coverage across all global news platforms today. Thanks to all our guests for joining us with their expert analysis, and thank you most of all for watching.